Someone is controlling you right now. And the terrifying part? You don't know it's happening. Not a stranger, not a villain, someone you trust, someone you might even love. And they're not doing it with force. They're doing it with something far more powerful. They're doing it with your own mind. Right now, somewhere in the world, a person is agreeing to something they desperately don't want to agree to. A person is apologizing for something that isn't their fault. A person is questioning a memory they know is real because someone they trust looked them in the eye and said, "That never happened." And none of them feel controlled. That's the point. That's always the point. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how this works. The 6 psychological weapons that bypass your rational mind completely. The 3 personality types most likely to use them against you. The tactics used not just by toxic partners, but by cults, corporations, and governments to keep millions of people compliant, confused, and grateful for it. And most importantly, I'm going to show you how to see it. Because the moment you can see the mechanism, the spell begins to break. Stay with me. This one will change how you see every relationship in your life. If you're listening to this, you've probably asked yourself at some point, why did I do that? Why did I agree to something I didn't want? Why did I feel guilty for saying no? Or maybe you've wondered, how do some people seem to get exactly what they want every single time without ever seeming to ask for it? That's what this audiobook is about. Manipulation, mind control, the invisible strings that people pull, sometimes consciously, sometimes without even knowing it, to make other people dance. Now, before we dive in, I want to be clear about something. Understanding manipulation is not about becoming a manipulator. It's about becoming unseeable to them. When you understand how a trap works, you stop walking into it. That's the only goal here. So let's start at the very beginning. What actually is manipulation? Robert Cialdini, in his landmark book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, published in 1984 and still one of the most referenced books in psychology, defines influence as the use of principles that guide human behavior. But manipulation is the dark side of influence. It's influence without consent. It's using those same psychological levers not to help someone make a better decision, but to bypass their decision-making entirely. Think about that for a second. Manipulation doesn't attack your intellect, it goes around it. It targets your emotions, your fears, your needs, your identity. It makes you feel like you chose something freely, when in reality, the choice was made for you long before you were even aware a choice was being offered. Psychologist George K. Simon, in his book In Sheep's Clothing, Understanding and Dealing with Manipulative People, published in 1996, puts it powerfully. He argues that manipulators know exactly what they're doing. They are not confused, broken people stumbling through life. They are covert aggressors. They want power over others, and they've learned, often from childhood, exactly how to get it without ever appearing aggressive. That last part is critical. Manipulation works precisely because it is invisible. The manipulator never looks like the bad guy. You feel the effects, the confusion, the self-doubt, the exhaustion, but you can never quite point to the moment it happened. That invisibility is not an accident, it's a feature. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Not all manipulators are calculating villains twirling mustaches. Research in social psychology tells us that manipulation exists on a spectrum. At one end, you have the unconscious, everyday social maneuvers we all sometimes use, a little guilt-tripping here, a white lie there. At the other end, you have deliberate, systematic psychological control, what some researchers call coercive control, which can cause lasting psychological damage. What determines where someone falls on that spectrum? Often, it comes down to 3 dark personality traits, and those 3 traits are so important that psychologists gave them their own name, the Dark Triad. We'll come back to the Dark Triad in detail, but first, let's talk about something even more fundamental. The 6 psychological weapons that make manipulation possible in the first place. Robert Cialdini spent years studying compliance professionals, salespeople, advertisers, fundraisers, negotiators, to understand how they got people to say yes. What he discovered became the foundation of modern persuasion science. He identified 6 universal principles of influence: reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. In their legitimate form, these principles are simply how human beings navigate social life efficiently. In their weaponized form, they are the tools of manipulation. Let's walk through each one. Reciprocity. This is the principle that when someone gives us something, we feel obligated to give something back. It's deeply wired into us. Anthropologists say reciprocity is one of the few social norms that appears in every known human culture. We feel genuinely uncomfortable when we owe someone. Manipulators exploit this by giving first, uninvited, often unsolicited, a small gift, a favor, a compliment. They create a debt you never agreed to take on, and then they collect. Cialdini describes this using a famous example from the Hare Krishna Society in the 1970s. They would hand flowers to strangers in airports before asking for donations. People who hadn't asked for the flower still felt compelled to give. Donations soared. In personal relationships, this looks like the partner who does so much for you, makes sure you know about every sacrifice, so that when they ask for something unreasonable, your sense of debt silences your objection. Commitment and consistency. Once we've taken a position or made a choice, we feel strong internal pressure to remain consistent with it. We don't like to see ourselves as hypocrites or flip-floppers. This is called cognitive dissonance, and we'll avoid it almost at any cost. Manipulators use this through what Cialdini calls the foot-in-the-door technique. Start with a small, harmless request that you agree to, and then slowly escalate. Each yes makes the next yes easier, because you're now someone who agrees. By the time the request is genuinely unreasonable, you've built a whole identity around compliance. This is exactly how many cult recruitment processes work. Robert Lifton described this in his 1961 book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, considered the foundational text on coercive persuasion. He documented how Chinese thought reform programs in the 1950s used incremental commitment to reshape people's entire belief systems. They didn't ask for full ideological surrender on day one. They asked for tiny agreements that snowballed. Social proof. When we're uncertain about what to do, we look at what others are doing. This is rational, actually. Other people's behavior often carries real information. But manipulators exploit our need for social proof by fabricating it. Everyone is doing this. All your friends already agree. You're the only one who feels that way. That last phrase, "you're the only one who feels that way," is a particularly cruel version of this. It isolates your experience and makes you doubt your own perception of reality, which leads us eventually to gaslighting, but we're not there yet. Authority. We're conditioned from childhood to defer to authority. Doctors, experts, leaders, bosses. Stanley Milgram's famous and disturbing obedience experiments at Yale University in the 1960s demonstrated just how far this goes. In his experiments, documented in the 1974 book Obedience to Authority, ordinary people administered what they believed were severe electric shocks to strangers simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. Milgram found that around 65% of participants continued to the maximum shock level. 65%. These were not sadists. They were regular people paralyzed by the authority figure in front of them. Manipulators leverage authority by constructing it artificially. Titles, confident body language, speaking with certainty, name-dropping credentials. They want you deferring to them before you've had time to evaluate whether they've actually earned that deference. Liking. Simply put, we say yes to people we like, and we like people who are similar to us, who complement us, who are physically attractive, who are familiar. Manipulators use this by becoming your mirror. They reflect your values, your language, your humor back at you. They make you feel deeply understood, seen.
This is called mirroring, and in therapeutic contexts, it builds genuine rapport. In manipulative contexts, it builds false intimacy, an emotional closeness designed to make you lower your guard. Scarcity. The less available something appears, the more we want it. Limited time offer, only one left. I don't do this for just anyone. Scarcity creates urgency, and urgency kills careful thinking. When we feel we might lose something, the rational brain quiets and the emotional brain takes over. Abusive partners use this constantly. They manufacture scarcity of their own love and approval, pulling back affection, going cold, threatening to leave, so that you are always in a mild state of fear and yearning. And a person in that state will do almost anything to restore the feeling of warmth. These 6 principles are not evil in themselves, they are human. But when deployed deliberately, without consent, in service of someone else's agenda, they become weapons. So who uses these weapons? Who are the manipulators? The answer is uncomfortable. They look just like everyone else. But psychological research has identified a cluster of personality traits that strongly predict manipulative behavior. Researchers Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams coined the term the Dark Triad in a 2002 paper in the Journal of Research in Personality. The 3 traits are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Let's understand each one. Narcissism, and here I mean the clinical pattern, not just vanity, involves an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep craving for admiration, and a striking lack of empathy for others. The narcissist's world is organized around a central question: am I getting the respect, attention, and status I deserve? People high in narcissism manipulate primarily to protect and inflate their ego. They charm when it serves them. They rage when they're challenged. They idealize you when you reflect their greatness back to them, and they devalue you the moment you stop. This cycle, idealize, devalue, discard, is one of the most documented patterns in relationships with narcissistic individuals. Sam Vaknin, in his detailed work Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, first published in 1999, describes narcissists as requiring constant narcissistic supply, attention, admiration, fear, or any form of intense emotional reaction from others. The specific emotion matters less than the intensity. Drama, conflict, devotion, all of it feeds the need. Machiavellianism, named for the 16th century Italian political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince in 1513, describes a personality orientation centered on strategic manipulation, cynicism about human nature, and a willingness to deceive to achieve goals. The Machiavellian is a planner. They are not driven by ego like the narcissist, but by strategy. They view people as resources to be managed. They are patient, calculating, and remarkably good at reading social situations. They know what you want, and they know how to make you think they're giving it to you. Machiavellianism is strongly associated with workplace manipulation. The colleague who appears helpful while quietly undermining you. The boss who creates loyalty through strategic favors. The negotiator who gives you small wins to distract you from the big loss. Psychopathy, the most clinically serious of the 3, involves shallow emotional responses, impulsivity, boldness, and a fundamental lack of remorse or guilt. The psychopath does not feel the emotional feedback that stops most people from harming others. When you hurt someone and it bothers you, that guilt is a feature, not a bug. It regulates your behavior. The psychopath operates without that regulator.
Robert Hare, arguably the world's foremost expert on psychopathy, developed the Psychopathy checklist in the 1970s and documented his findings in his 1993 book, Without Conscience: The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. Hare estimated that roughly 1% of the general population meets criteria for psychopathy, but in certain high-power environments like finance, law, and corporate leadership, that number may be several times higher. This is not because corporations deliberately select psychopaths. It's because certain psychopathic traits, fearlessness,
charm, a willingness to make hard decisions without emotional interference, can look like leadership qualities in the early stages of a career. But here's the important takeaway. Most manipulation in everyday life is not coming from clinical psychopaths or extreme narcissists. Most of it is coming from ordinary people using ordinary psychological levers, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, because it works. Of all the forms manipulation takes, gaslighting may be the most insidious. Not because it's the most dramatic, but because it attacks the very instrument you use to detect manipulation in the first place, your own perception of reality. The term comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband secretly dims the gas-powered lights in the home and then insists to his wife that nothing has changed, she's imagining it. The film is a slow, disturbing portrait of how someone can be made to doubt their own senses, their own memory, their own sanity. Robin Stern, in her 2007 book, The Gaslight Effect, How to Spot and Survive the Hidden Manipulation Others Use to Control Your Life, identifies gaslighting as a dance that requires two participants, a gaslighter who needs to be right and in control, and a gaslightee who is willing to question their own reality to maintain the relationship. That second part is uncomfortable, because it means that certain psychological vulnerabilities, a deep need for approval, a fear of conflict, low self-esteem, can make someone more susceptible to gaslighting. This is not victim blaming. It's important information, because when you understand your vulnerabilities, you can protect them. What does gaslighting look like in real life? Let's go through the patterns. Flat denial. That never happened. You remember an event clearly. The other person looks you in the eye and tells you your memory is wrong. The more firmly they deny it, the more you begin to doubt yourself, especially if there's someone you trust and love. Trivializing. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. It was just a joke. When your emotional response to something is consistently treated as the problem rather than the thing that caused it, you learn to suppress your emotional responses. You stop trusting your own feelings as data. Diverting. When confronted, the gaslighter shifts the subject entirely, often by attacking you on a separate issue. You want to talk about what I said? Let's talk about what you did last week. The original issue never gets resolved. You're always on the defensive. Counterattacking. This is subtle and devastating. I can't believe you'd accuse me of that after everything I've done for you. I'm so hurt. Suddenly, you are the abuser and they are the victim. Your legitimate concern becomes a source of your own guilt. Questioning your memory. You always get things confused. You were drunk. Your memory has never been reliable. Over time, a person who is told repeatedly that their memory is faulty begins to actually distrust their own recollections. They start to outsource their reality to the gaslighter. Dr. Judith Herman, in her foundational 1992 text, Trauma and Recovery, documents how this kind of sustained reality distortion, especially in close relationships, can produce symptoms nearly indistinguishable from clinical PTSD. The psychological damage is real, measurable, and lasting. The particularly cruel feature of gaslighting is that it gets easier over time. As the target's self-trust erodes, they become more dependent on the gaslighter to interpret reality for them. What began as manipulation becomes, in extreme cases, something close to psychological captivity. How do you defend against it? The single most powerful tool is documentation. Write things down. Date your entries. When you have a record of your own perceptions that exists outside the relationship, you preserve your grip on reality even when it's being challenged. The second tool is outside perspective. Gaslighters systematically isolate their targets from friends and family because those outside observers can confirm your reality. If someone in your life is subtly pushing away the people who know you well, pay attention to that. Individual manipulation is damaging enough, but history shows us something even more chilling, that these same psychological mechanisms can operate at scale, that entire groups of people can be brought under coercive control using the same principles we've been discussing, just applied systematically. We call these groups cults, but the word is misleading. It conjures images of robes and isolation compounds. In reality, coercive control groups exist in many forms: high-control religious organizations, multi-level marketing companies, certain political movements, and abusive relationships where one partner controls everything. Robert Lifton, in Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, identified 8 criteria that defined what he called totalist environments. Let's walk through the most critical ones. Milieu control. The group controls the environment: physical, social, and informational. Members are isolated from outside information and outside relationships. The group becomes the only source of truth. This is the foundation everything else is built on, because once you control someone's information environment, you control their reality. Mystical manipulation. The leadership uses seemingly spontaneous experiences, miracles, revelations, highly emotional group events that are actually staged or manufactured. These experiences create powerful emotional memories that bond members to the group and to the ideology. The demand for purity. The world is divided into pure and impure, saved and damned, us and them. Members are taught that any negative feeling about the group is a sign of their own impurity, not a rational signal worth heeding. This is perhaps the most elegant trap in cult psychology. Your own doubt becomes evidence against you. Confession. Members are required to confess their doubts, sins, and past behaviors, often publicly. This creates an archive of vulnerability that leadership can use as leverage. It also creates shame that binds members more tightly to the group, because leaving would mean others know your secrets. Loading the language. Groups develop a specialized vocabulary, thought-terminating cliches, as Lifton calls them. When a complex, uncomfortable idea can be shut down with a single group-approved phrase, "That's just your ego talking," or "trust the process," critical thinking is suppressed at the linguistic level. Stephen Hassan, a former cult member turned counselor, built on Lifton's work in his 1988 book, Combating Cult Mind Control. Hassan developed the BITE model, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control, as a framework for identifying coercive control. His argument is that cults don't brainwash people in a dramatic science fiction sense. They simply use consistent, layered psychological pressure to make one behavioral and cognitive system feel like the only possible reality. The exit cost is kept high through social engineering. If all of your friendships, your family relationships, your professional network, and your sense of identity are embedded in the group, leaving means losing everything simultaneously. Most people will endure extraordinary psychological discomfort rather than face that kind of total loss. What does this tell us about manipulation at a societal level? It tells us that no one is immune. The research consistently shows that cult membership is not predicted by intelligence or education. It is predicted by life circumstances, being at a moment of vulnerability, transition, or longing for meaning, combined with a group that presents itself as the answer. The protection is not greater intelligence. It is self-awareness, strong outside relationships, and a practiced habit of asking, who benefits from me believing this? We've covered a lot of darkness. Let's talk about light. Because all of this knowledge, the 6 weapons of influence, the Dark Triad, gaslighting, coercive control, it only matters if it changes something. If it makes you harder to manipulate, if it makes the people you love safer. That's the point. So what does psychological research actually tell us about resistance? Build your self-knowledge. The research is clear. People with high self-awareness are significantly harder to manipulate. Why? Because manipulation works by exploiting the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. It inserts itself into your blind spots. The smaller those blind spots, the less room there is to work with. Nathaniel Branden, in his 1994 book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, argues that self-esteem, genuine self-esteem, not arrogance, is the single greatest psychological protection a person can have. Not because it makes you invulnerable, but because people with healthy self-worth don't need the approval of manipulators. They can afford to say no. Trust discomfort. This sounds counterintuitive, but your emotional discomfort is often your first and most accurate warning signal. When something feels off, even if you can't articulate why, even if the other person is providing a perfectly logical explanation, take that feeling seriously. Cialdini explicitly advises this. When you feel pressure, urgency, or a vague wrongness in a social interaction, treat it as a signal to slow down, not speed up. Use the pause. Manipulators create urgency because urgency disrupts careful thinking. One of the simplest and most powerful acts of resistance is to introduce time. I need to think about this. Let me get back to you. These are not weaknesses, they are the sentences that protect you. A legitimate request will survive a pause, a manipulative one rarely will. Diversify your reality. Maintain relationships outside of any group or individual that consumes a significant amount of your time and loyalty, not as a paranoid strategy, but as basic psychological hygiene. Outside perspectives are oxygen. They're how you keep your sense of reality calibrated. Name what you see. There is genuine power in labeling manipulation when you recognize it, at least to yourself, and sometimes directly to the person doing it. Research on emotional regulation consistently finds that naming an experience reduces its emotional intensity. When you say to yourself, "This is the foot in the door technique," or "This is trivializing," you break the spell. You move from being inside the experience to observing it. Understand that the goal is not to win arguments. Manipulators are often skilled debaters. They can out-argue you. They can make you feel stupid or irrational for your concerns. The goal of recognizing manipulation is not to defeat the manipulator in a verbal contest. It's to protect yourself. You don't need their acknowledgement. You don't need them to admit what they did. You just need to act in your own interest. Before we close, there's one more important question to sit with. We've talked at length about how manipulation works and who uses it, but where is the line between legitimate influence and manipulation? This matters because influence, persuasion, motivation, even advertising is everywhere. Every leader influences their team. Every parent shapes their children's beliefs. Every teacher influences what students find worth knowing. Cialdini himself makes a distinction that I think is worth ending with. Legitimate persuasion, he argues, involves aligning your interests with the other person's genuine interests. You are helping them see something true that serves them. Manipulation inverts this. It exploits their psychology to serve your interests at their expense. The philosopher Immanuel Kant put it differently, though not about manipulation specifically. He argued that the fundamental ethical principle is to treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as means. When you manipulate someone, you are using them as an instrument. You have reduced them from a full person to a tool. Philip Zimbardo, of the famous Stanford prison experiment, spent the second half of his career studying what he called the Lucifer effect. His 2007 book by the same name explores how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary harm. His conclusion was not that evil is exceptional, it is situational. It arises when institutions, systems, and social pressures strip away individual accountability. The lesson is bidirectional. We must protect ourselves from being manipulated, but we must also watch ourselves, watch the small daily ways we might shade the truth, apply pressure, play on someone's fear, and ask whether what we are doing is persuasion or coercion, influence or manipulation. The line is consent. The line is honesty. The line is whether you'd be comfortable if the other person saw exactly what you were doing and why.
You've just spent 30 minutes in some of the darker corners of human psychology. And I hope what you're walking away with is not paranoia, not a conviction that everyone around you is plotting your manipulation, but something more useful: clarity. The manipulator's greatest advantage is your unawareness. The moment you can see the mechanism, the moment you recognize the urgency being manufactured or the reality being reframed, the spell begins to break. You cannot control what others do, but you can understand it, and understanding changes everything.
The books we've drawn from today, Cialdini's Influence, Simon's In Sheep's Clothing, Lifton's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Hare's Without Conscience, Herman's Trauma and Recovery, Stern's The Gaslight Effect, Voknin's Malignant Self-Love, Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect, Brandon's The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. Each of these is worth reading in full. Each one will give you more tools, more light. Stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, the best protection against manipulation is a strong, clear sense of who you are and what you value. Until next time.